3 and an extra by Rudyard Kipling. When halter and heel ropes are slipped, do not give chase with sticks but with gram. Punjabi proverb. After marriage arrives a reaction, sometimes a big, sometimes a little one, but it comes sooner or later, and must be tided over by both parties if they desire the rest of their lives to go with the current. In the case of the Cusack-Bremels, this reaction did not set in till the 3rd year after the wedding. Bremel was hard to hold at the best of times, but he was a beautiful husband until the baby died and Mrs. Bremel wore black, grew thin, and mourned as if the bottom of the universe had fallen out. Perhaps Bremel ought to have comforted her. He tried to do so, but the more he comforted the more Mrs. Bremel grieved, and, consequently, the more uncomfortable Bremel grew. The fact was that they both needed a tonic. And they got it. Mrs. Bremel can afford to laugh now, but it was no laughing matter to her at the time. You see, Mrs. Hawksby appeared on the horizon, and where she existed was fair chance of trouble. At Simla her by name was the Stormy Petrel. She had won that title 5 times to my own certain knowledge. She was a little, brown, thin, almost skinny, woman, with big, rolling, violet blue eyes, and the sweetest manners in the world. You had only to mention her name at afternoon teas for every woman in the room to rise up and call her, well, not blessed. She was clever, witty, brilliant, and sparkling beyond most of her kind, but possessed of many devils of malice and mischievousness. She could be nice, though, even to her own sex. But that is another story. Bremel went off at score after the baby's death and the general discomfort that followed, and Mrs. Hawksby annexed him. She took no pleasure in hiding her captives. She annexed him publicly, and saw that the public saw it. He rode with her, and walked with her, and talked with her, and picnicked with her, and tiffined at polities with her, till people put up their eyebrows and said, "Shocking." Mrs. Bremel stayed at home turning over the dead baby's frocks and crying into the empty cradle. She did not care to do anything else. But some 8 dear, affectionate lady friends explained the situation at length to her in case she should miss the cream of it. Mrs. Bremel listened quietly, and thanked them for their good offices. She was not as clever as Mrs. Hawksby, but she was no fool. She kept her own counsel, and did not speak to Bremel of what she had heard. This is worth remembering. Speaking to, or crying over, a husband never did any good yet. When Bremel was at home, which was not often, he was more affectionate than usual, and that showed his hand. The affection was forced partly to soothe his own conscience and partly to soothe Mrs. Bremel. It failed in both regards. Then the A.D.C. in waiting was commanded by their Excellencies, Lord and Lady Lytton, to invite Mr. and Mrs. Cusack Bremel to Peterhof on July 26 at 9:30 p.m. dancing in the bottom left-hand corner. "I can't go," said Mrs. Bremel, "it is too soon after poor little Florrie. But it need not stop you, Tom." She meant what she said then, and Bremel said that he would go just to put in an appearance. Here he spoke the thing which was not, and Mrs. Bremel knew it. She guessed, a woman's guess is much more accurate than a man's certainty, that he had meant to go from the first, and with Mrs. Hawksby. She sat down to think, and the outcome of her thoughts was that the memory of a dead child was worth considerably less than the affections of a living husband. She made her plan and staked her all upon it. In that hour she discovered that she knew Tom Bremel thoroughly, and this knowledge she acted on. "Tom," said she, "I shall be dining out at the Longmores on the evening of the 26th. You'd better dine at the club." This saved Bremel from making an excuse to get away and dine with Mrs. Hawksby, so he was grateful, and felt small and mean at the same time, which was wholesome. Bremel left the house at 5 for a ride. About 5:30 in the evening a large leather-covered basket came in from Phelps for Mrs. Bremel. She was a woman who knew how to dress, and she had not spent a week on designing that dress and having it gored, and hemmed, and herringboned, and tucked and rucked, or whatever the terms are, for nothing. It was a gorgeous dress, slight mourning. I can't describe it, but it was what the Queen calls a creation, a thing that hit you straight between the eyes and made you gasp. She had not much heart for what she was going to do, but as she glanced at the long mirror she had the satisfaction of knowing that she had never looked so well in her life. She was a large blonde and, when she chose, carried herself superbly. After the dinner at the Longmores, she went on to the dance, a little late, and encountered Bremmel with Mrs. Hawksby on his arm. That made her flush, and as the men crowded round her for dances she looked magnificent. She filled up all her dances except 3, and those she left blank. Mrs. Hawksby caught her eye once, and she knew it was war, real war, between them. She started handicapped in the struggle, for she had ordered Bremmel about just the least little bit in the world too much, and he was beginning to resent it. Moreover, he had never seen his wife look so lovely. He stared at her from doorways, and glared at her from passages as she went about with her partners, and the more he stared, the more taken was he. He could scarcely believe that this was the woman with the red eyes and the black stuff gown who used to weep over the eggs at breakfast. Mrs. Hawksby did her best to hold him in play, but, after 2 dances, he crossed over to his wife and asked for a dance. "I'm afraid you've come too late, Mr. Bremmel," she said, with her eyes twinkling. Then he begged her to give him a dance, and, as a great favor, she allowed him the 5th waltz. Luckily 5 stood vacant on his program. They danced it together, and there was a little flutter round the room. Bremmel had a sort of notion that his wife could dance, but he never knew she danced so divinely. At the end of that waltz he asked for another, as a favor, not as a right, and Mrs. Bremmel said, "Show me your program, dear." He showed it as a naughty little schoolboy hands up contraband sweets to a master. There was a fair sprinkling of H on it besides H at supper. Mrs. Bremmel said nothing, but she smiled contemptuously, ran her pencil through 7 and 9, 2 H's and returned the card with her own name written above, a pet name that only she and her husband used. Then she shook her finger at him, and said, laughing, "Oh, you silly, silly boy." Mrs. Hawksby heard that, and, she owned as much, felt that she had the worst of it. Bremmel accepted 7 and 9 gratefully. They danced 7, and sat out 9 in one of the little tents. What Bremmel said and what Mrs. Bremmel said is no concern of anyone's. When the band struck up the roast beef of Old England, the 2 went out into the veranda, and Bremmel began looking for his wife's dandy. This was before rickshaw days, while she went into the cloakroom. Mrs. Hawksby came up and said, "You take me into supper, I think, Mr. Bremmel." Bremmel turned red and looked foolish. I'm going home with my wife, Mrs. Hawksby. I think there has been a little mistake." Being a man, he spoke as though Mrs. Hawksby were entirely responsible. Mrs. Bremmel came out of the cloakroom in a swansdown cloak with a white cloud round her head. She looked radiant, and she had a right to. The couple went off in the darkness together, Bremmel riding very close to the dandy. Then says Mrs. Hawksby to me, she looked a trifle faded and jaded in the lamplight, "Take my word for it, the silliest woman can manage a clever man, but it needs a very clever woman to manage a fool." Then we went into supper.